Okay, so in this last part of the lecture, we're going to have a look at malicious software. So we'll have a more in-depth look um, in the incident response and malware analysis module, but this will give a bit of an overview to some of the threats. So malicious software or malware, any type of software which is written with some sort of malicious intent, something that will do things that the user wasn't intending software to do. And there are several types, and it's a kind of growing area at the moment and very hard to defend against. So we're usually, in terms of network security, interested in malware which is moving across the network. So typically things like worms and self-replicating malware, but obviously host-based and user targeted malware is also typically moving across the network now, quite often hidden in inconspicuous places. So we've got a kind of basic categorization again, much like the other categorizations, just to try and give you some background. So we're going to look at viruses and worms and Trojans and some malicious code. So just to try and split these up and highlight the main differences. So there's a fair amount of crossover now, and there's quite a lot of blended threats where you have more than one pieces of malware working together, or several different types of malware, or malware within malware. But basically viruses are a bit like a human virus, so they need a host. So some sort of parasitic code, some sort of code which, some sort of software which attaches itself to other software. So quite often at the beginning of a piece of software, so it will run before the main program which is intended to be run. Quite often pieces are executable. So typically replicates, infects other parts of the system or other devices or other pieces of software or code, but typically need some sort of user interaction. So the user has to run a piece of code or an application or a program for the virus to run and to spread. So as opposed to a worm, which is a type of malware which can self-replicate, so it can spread without any sort of interaction from the user. So it's designed to, typically the viruses may cause damage, and typically in the past worms have tended not to cause damage but to spread and possibly clog up systems. So typically no user interaction. So their operation might be to copy themselves, look around the network for other hosts. So these are quite interesting in terms of network security. So this in the middle is, I think that might be the sapphire worm. Yeah, sapphire. So this is from CADA. So this is an excellent place to go and have a look at. They have all sorts of data sets from attacks, and they have some quite interesting animations as well. So there's a few little animations I've dropped in here. So you can go in here and you can have a look at some of the worms we're talking about. But it's also an excellent website for other things like such as data sets, as I said. So it's got lots of different things. So Trojan horses, another type. So a virus tends to be parasitic code as part of or injected into another piece of code. Worms tend to be a separate, self-contained, and Trojans are basically some sort of malware which has been written to look like something else. So something like a system file or an application itself, and typically doesn't replicate. So they're usually used to get onto a system and infect a system in some way, or deliver an exploit or some sort of other piece of malware, a bit like a Trojan horse from history. Okay, so we've probably covered some of this. So parasitic code. So these are so typically do damage, and in the past worms have tended not to do damage, which is a bit of a difference. And these are some of the sort of main types, just a bit of an overview. So kind of program virus, which will attach some executable code, inside an executable type program. Boot sector or registry malware, so putting some sort of code somewhere which will run when a machine boots, or when Windows starts, for example, or when some sort of process kicks off and it's looking at registry keys. And then you have things like macro virus. So this is something that's comes and goes. These types of things. So this is an issue with making applications where you can insert executable code or interpreted code into sort of data, historically into sections which would typically be data only. So this is also a huge problem in terms of web programming, where there's a mixture of things like database attacks, where you can actually insert some sort of code, some sort of interpreted code into something which is intended to take data, and take that data and maybe store it in a database, and in actual fact you can actually manage to run code against an interpreter somewhere along the line, whether it's the database interpreter or in terms of cross-site scripting, it might be some scripting interpreter in the web application itself. So we'll look at that in a lot more detail in the pen testing module. We'll have a look at web attacks and web application attacks and database injection attacks. So worms, as we've said, self-contained, so that's one thing. Kind of program on its own, which is going to typically infect a system and then try and spread across other systems. And the problem with worms is that they can proliferate very quickly. They can clog up network bandwidth. They can deny service to services. So the rapid spread's the interesting part. So I think I've got some examples. So these are some historical ones. There are dozens, but these are quite interesting. So the Morris worm was one of the first pieces of malware. So that was kind of done by accident. It was a program written to try and find out about hosts on the network, using some of the network applications, so Finger Demon and Sendmail, to try and spread around and count hosts and gather information, and it kind of went a little bit out of control. And 6,000 machines doesn't seem that many, but when it's 10% of the internet at that point, it caused a fair amount of problems, and they had to disconnect many machines to stop the spread. So nothing has really been seen like that before, or dealt with, or defended against. There was no thoughts of having to detect these types of things. So Code Red's quite an interesting one, because it was incredibly fast spreading. So it was actually a buffer overflow vulnerability in the Microsoft web server, so IIS web server, which was run on a lot of machines at that point. So yeah, 350,000 systems in under 15 hours is fairly fast, still even to this day. So this is the old Netscape Navigator, if anyone remembers that, and this is the message that popped up, and it defaced the website, and it actually caused a fair amount of damage. So these are some of the animations you can have a look at for some of these, if it's going to load. There we go. So this is your victims spiraling out of control here, and this is your time going up here. You can see it spread across the entire world within just a few hours. So quite interesting. You can have a look at those. So SQL Slammer, or the Sapphire Worms, that was the one we looked at before, 2003. So SQL Slammer, because it spread itself through scanning for buffer overflows in Microsoft SQL Server in the early days of SQL Server. So this is the sort of stuff we're interested in and you should sort of think about when you're analysing the traffic and looking at things in the lab. It's UDP protocol. Um, Again, no connection, connectionless protocol, and over port 1434. So that's basically what I was scanning for to see if it could infect other machines on the network. And one of the problems was that it was installed in a lot of desktop Windows systems by default, and ran by default. So this port was open, causing a sort of risk, which really didn't need to be there. I mean, a lot of these machines weren't servers; they didn't really need to be running that, and that's the sort of holes that have been closed since then. So 10 times faster than Code Red, so still one of the fastest ones ever. Trying to remember there's a really fast one that I don't think I've got here. And again, patches were available from the year before, just things weren't patched. So again, another typical problem with malware. So Witty Worm, quite interesting from the point of view of one of the first worms to be, or the first big worm to be seen that was actually spread from multiple hosts around the world simultaneously. So it was kind of seeded and roughly the same time started spreading. So quite interesting, and it was one of the first sort of worms that had been analysed that actually caused some damage. So actually overwrote parts of the hard disk of the systems that infected, and also the infection was via a security application. So that was a fairly embarrassing one. Also, let's have a look at this. I think you can actually see the spread starts in multiple places at the same time. There you go. So you can kind of, well, you can't really. It's not very good actually. I think there's a better one that's worldwide. Might be that one, yeah. I think that one actually maybe starts in Australia and stuff at exactly the same time as it started in the States. So you can have a look at those animations. So Face is an interesting one because it's one of the first ones that was actually spread. So it's kind of Facebook. So it's a Facebook worm. One of the first ones that started spreading along the lines of social networking. And the Conficker worm, which is a worm that looked for various vulnerabilities and various ways of spreading and proliferating, and 10 million machines, so it's starting to get quite large, and as a lot of worms in kind of the mid 2000s actually brought down a lot of systems. So these were kind of British systems that ground to a halt. So yeah, causing a lot of damage by just clogging up networks. So this is one that's particularly interesting if you want to have a look. This is quite a good article. There's two or three quite in-depth articles now. So this is back to kind of cyber warfare, cyber espionage. So Stuxnet. So there was a lot of speculation around the Stuxnet worm, Trojan blended kind of malware. It used several types of malware, but it was a worm as it self-replicated and was delivered as a kind of Trojan originally. And after several years of speculation and much analysis of this quite large piece of malware, quite unusually large piece of malware. So this is a typical kind of 10K kind of pieces of malware, worms or virus type codes, quite small, and this thing's enormous, and it downloaded modules as it went, depending on the systems and where. What kind of systems it infected, and basically, eventually, after quite a lot of analysis, it was discovered that it was definitely written very complex over a period of years by the looks of it, and it was targeting a specific type of SCADA system, basically Siemens PLCs, and also after quite a lot of dynamic analysis, so static analysis, looking at the actual code itself, try to reverse engineer the code, looking at the patterns in the code, the types of system calls that the code was doing. That's the code that they could get at, because a lot of the modular code that was downloaded was actually encrypted, and only unencrypted when the malware decided that it needed certain modules and certain things um, to spread or to infect or to proliferate. And yeah, so they basically after doing some dynamic analysis, so what they did was they set up some command and control servers which the malware connected back to do its download, and they simulated command and control channels, and they found that it was basically coming, almost all the infections were coming from a certain small area, and most of it was around Iran. And after a lot of investigation, it was determined that these were targeting nuclear uranium enrichment centrifuge systems, which is what these were controlling, um, and pretty much to try and speed them up and slow them down to destroy centrifuge. And one of the first big kind of cyber weapons that's really been confirmed. Had some very interesting stuff. So some really interesting stuff in here about how it bypassed. So if it spread to certain systems in the US, for example, certain flags in those systems, certain pieces of code would be highlighted, and it would pass over those systems, so it would never infect those systems. So there's safety precautions in case it ever spread or was used against US facilities, which is fairly interesting. So there's lots of good stuff in here if you want to have a look. It's really interesting. It uses different types of malware, downloads code. It actually spread between very secure the actual uranium enrichment plant systems were all air gapped. So it actually was very clever, very strategic. Downloaded modules which put bits of malware onto USBs, and when those USBs were taken over the air gap into the more sensitive network, they would infect the machines there. So extremely complex and interesting if you want to have a look at that. So Trojans, yeah, we've kind of talked about that a little bit. It doesn't really propagate itself, more as a sort of dropper for other pieces of malware. Typically things like backdoors, rootkits, things like remote access Trojans, which are kind of backdoors. So rootkits are very low level pieces of malware, either to allow remote access to the system or to hide and possibly gather information, or possibly wait for instructions in terms of a sort of botnet type thing. And this is something that's been on the rise in the last few years. You see a lot of discussion about RATs, so remote access kind of toolkit originally. So these originally were toolkits to provide remote access to systems, and now remote access Trojans. So these get dropped on systems, and the bad guys can get remote access to your system. They do things like keystroke logging, take pictures of your screen, take control of devices. So this is quite a common kind of thing, and it's actually become been developed into things like crimeware kits and rat kits. So you get things like this. So this is actually the Dark Comet rat, which has been developed from a valid application for remote access and administration, and now you can basically mix and match all sorts of things. So this is a kind of builder. You can use various kind of plugins to kind of create different things, remote registry access, various things, and you can kind of build your own little sort of server agent, and then that can be maybe delivered to the target machines, to the victim machines, and then it will connect back and allow the bad guy access to various things that they've packaged up in that little server. So yeah, quite complex, and you see this a lot. So this is a kind of new type of malware, fairly new, and definitely on the rise. So we've had a couple of students doing MSc dissertations on this. One particularly good one who's just finished. which is where I got this from. So that's this one here. So I'll be putting that up on the dissertation's website quite soon. So this is Cryptolocker. So this is one of the kind of very famous or well-known types of ransomware. So ransomware basically comes in two types. The older type was some sort of malware which got into the system and then it denied the user access to either some applications or just locked the system completely. And then usually they pop up some sort of screen um, where the victim is prompted to pay some sort of ransom so it's trying to extort some sort of money to unlock the system, or in the newer pieces of ransomware looked at, it basically encrypts files. So the different pieces of malware look at different files. Some of the newer ones are quite sophisticated. They search for certain types of files and certain core things that might be important to the user, and they'll lock all these files. They'll lock all shared drives. So any backup drives that are connected, they'll lock those up as well with some quite serious encryption. Usually asymmetric encryption algorithm, which basically is unbreakable, because the private key is used to unlock and it's never on the system. So what happens is, in Cryptolocker, once it's infected the system, it contacts a CNC server. The CNC server generates a key pair. One key is sent back, which encrypts the system, and the other key, which can unencrypt the system, is kept on the server. So the victim has no chance of unencrypting these files unless they pay the ransom. So some of the newer detection mechanisms detected this connection back to the server and managed to prevent the key coming and the encryption happening. So some of the newer ones, such as Tesla Crypt, for example, actually delivers keys and does the encryption before it contacts or prompts the user or anything. So they're even harder to defend against. So some of the defenses are actually just keep good disconnected backups, and that's actually quite, yeah. Some of the newer ones do things like they delete the Windows shadow copy, so you can't even use that for recovery. So it's quite interesting. So this is actually, I think I've got it open here actually. Yes. So this is Siva's dissertation, and yeah, I'll be putting this up. So this was a distinction, and it was excellent. So it's just August 2015. So I'll put that up on the dissertation's website quite shortly. So this is another thing we've kind of touched on. So kind of web attacks. So malicious website code. So this is a typical cross-site scripting type attack where an intruder will go to a website and they'll find a flaw in it where they can inject some code. So when the next user comes along, goes to the website, the exploit happens, the code runs, and the code can do all sorts of things. It can inject things into the browser, so it can inject code into the actual running code in the browser, which can then redirect the valid user to somewhere, another server, either to deliver malware or whatever. So there's various different types of cross-site scripting injection, which is injecting some sort of interpreted code. So this code runs on the fly, and so does the web server side, application side code. So we'll be looking at these types of attacks and pen testing in the second trimester. So these are some of our kind of mitigations, some of our prevention mechanisms, and I'd say that probably the most important one for all these things is user education. So it's kind of split in two. You've got the kind of traditional things, so antivirus, which is basically looking for signatures, and most of the antivirus now use some sort of heuristics where they're looking for some kind of patterns, so not just strict signatures, but maybe things that match, approximate matching. We've got our network security controls, which can do some kind of detection, again usually signature based. Some filtering can look for email attachments with certain types of signatures, and similar to your antivirus. Obviously keeping your patches up to date is one of the most important things to defend against these types of malware as well. But again, we're defending against things that we know, so signatures or malware that we've seen before, and things like signing code can again help with that. This is more difficult, so zero-day type malware, things we haven't seen before. So they take some malware and they alter the code, or it alters itself, even worse. And this is very difficult to compare against. So these are kind of ongoing research problems which are quite interesting. So a lot of things like fuzzy matching, similarity distance matching, similarity hashing. I'm not sure if actually there's that much in that, but I was looking at that myself, and things like machine learning for non-exact matching, so trying to find new or detect new types of malware by analysing patterns in malware, and try to find similar things that may have been changed. So other more traditional methods are things like reducing the attack surface, so hardening the systems, which we'll kind of look at in the next couple of weeks, probably for the coursework. So removing services and applications and unwanted passwords and things like that, user accounts, and separation of services, so worms can't spread via trust that maybe shouldn't be there. So this is your kind of attacks that we've been through, or some of these attacks which can be associated with levels, layers in the models. So it gives you an idea of some of the protocols that these attacks are spread by or using. So we've got things there like DOS with IP and IP spoofing for the headers, and some of our DNS attacks using spoofing. And then we've got stuff up here which is more our kind of application layer, where we've got code running and we've got password attacks and applications and things like that. So that's the kind of thing we want you to be looking at when you're doing the labs and reviewing the lecture material and reading is where things are coming in the network stack, and how we can defend against them in these different layers. So this is a kind of very basic defenses overview. So security policy, something that I mentioned at the beginning of the main lecture. Still about 30% of companies don't have a security policy. So this is a kind of RFC from a good while back. I did a little bit of research into this a few years ago. So that's quite an interesting kind of baseline for security policies. Security policies is try to protect not just the assets, but the people as well that work in the organisation. So kind of detailing and laying out guidelines and standards and also defences and policies at the technical level. So starting at the kind of top level and working down from management and risk and money right down to technical policies, which we'll look at. So high level management, mission statements, standards and guidelines feeding into kind of lower level policies which drive security procedures and testing and auditing and setting up of our kind of security devices and technical things as well. So all these things come in, and again the aim, back to the beginning of the lecture, is to protect our CIA of our assets. So this is a kind of very simplified life cycle which covers some of the things. You start off with a security policy. You try and secure your network as best as possible with your security controls, and then you constantly monitor. So we look at the network the whole time, and also while we're doing that, we may periodically do things like security testing and other types of auditing and compliance, and all of this feeds back into our policies, which continue to improve as an ongoing kind of process. So there's another thing that's talked a lot about, and especially in network security. So defense in depth type approach. So this is a kind of medieval type historical approach where we've got lots of different defenses, and really what these are aimed to do is to slow down any attack and to try and stop the attack as best we can, but also slow it down so we can actually detect intruders and do something about it and control things that are happening in our network. And again, it's kind of weakest link and no silver bullet. There's not one thing we can put in place that's going to make everything secure. We just have to do our best at all different levels and all different layers and overlapping security. This is a type of very high level kind of thing where you've got personal firewalls and AVs and intrusion detection devices and perimeter firewalls. And you've got monitoring, so everything's feeding back, so we can do monitoring and an analysis and investigation, so we're logging things so we can investigate if we find a breach, and splitting up of different subnets with different policies, trying to keep our really important sensitive information here and having less sensitive information here, and trust between the parts of the network. So we'll look at all these individual things in the weeks to come. And here's some of our defenses, our defense in depth kind of thing, again applied to our model. So if we keep coming back to our model, we can see the protocols and the issues and some of the attacks against the different levels. And then here's some of our different protection and defense mechanisms. So we can use firewalls at various levels. We've got firewalls up here as well, web application firewalls working as software. We've got virtualized firewalls now, right down to kind of private VLANs at the network layer. So we'll look at all these in the weeks to come, and that's probably fine for today.